So I'm going to go share screen. So hopefully this is recording. Looks like it is. Okay. So this is lymphatics, and this is for test 5. I'll have it up on the website soon. So anyway, a lot of this is rehash. Some of it's new material. But functions of the lymphatic system is, production, circulation of lymphocytes, protection against pathogens. That's what your leukocytes or your white blood cells do. There's other immune components in there. Return of fluid from the interstitial space to the right atrium of the heart, and we'll get to how that happens. And aids in the absorption, transport of dietary lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins. So the lipid solubles are A, D, K, and E. So components, make sure you can do this on point and name on a model or a chart or a laminate. So spleen, the thymus, don't confuse that with the thyroid, totally different gland there or organ. 5 tonsils, that'll be 2 palatine tonsils, 2 lingual tonsils, and then you have 1 pharyngeal. And I'll show you those. Lymph nodes, you got them distributed in places, around the body. Lymphatic vessels, same thing. So we haven't lectured on these yet, but there's some structures called Peyer's patches, which are basically lymphatic nodules in the intestines, and then lacteals. I'll show you those that are located in the villi in the intestines, and they absorb fat and fat-soluble vitamins. Okay, so I have this laminate with no words on it. Make sure you can pick out the spleen. Make sure you can pick out the thymus. Make sure you can pick out lymph nodes. Like these would be axillary lymph nodes. These would be cervical. These would be inguinal. Those are generally the only ones I point at. These are just lymphatic vessels. We'll learn about this little structure later, the cisterna chyli, just an expanded area there, at the bottom of a big lymphatic vessel. So lymphocytes are a type of leukocyte. Remember, you got 5 big types of leukocytes. Remember, never let monkeys eat bananas. So neutrophil, lymphocyte, monocyte, eosinophil, basophils, right? So this one is the lymphocytes that we're talking about. And so mainly I want you to think antibodies when you see lymphocytes. There's different kinds of lymphocytes that do different things, but mainly I want you to think antibodies. They travel through the cardiovascular and lymphatic systems. So there's 3 basic types, T's and B's, and natural killer cells. And there's actually some subdivisions here. So let's see what the next slide says. T cells. Well, they're called T cells because they're thymus dependent. And so that's what the T stands for, is the thymus. So 80% of the circulating lymphocytes are T cells, but they look pretty much the same as B cells under your microscope. There's also some things, like cytotoxic Ts, helper Ts, suppressor Ts, there's subdivisions. Mainly when you see T cells, I want you to think of helper Ts. So those are going to help control the activity of B cells. And B cells are the ones that actually code for the antibodies. So anyway, you can have memory cells, and like these memory T cells after a primary infection are on reserve. And then if the same antigen appears again, hopefully that'll get recognized by the immune system, and you'll have basically an immunity. This should say affected, not effected, by the human immunodeficiency virus, or they can be. B cells, they're not as many B cells, but like I said, they all look pretty much the same under your light microscope. They're responsible for the production of antibodies, which are immunoglobulins, and the antibodies can bind to antigens, and they'll be specific, for certain antigens. And we'll go a little bit more into how that works, although we don't go too deeply into it. Like I said, this is anatomy. It's not physiology or pathology. Natural killers, cells, they can kill things directly, pathogens. They can also kill off infected or cancerous cells. So your immune system is involved in keeping cancer in check. That's what a lot of people forget. And that was one of the first clues when HIV first came around. There were some weird cancers showing up that never showed up hardly before. And then that was the first clue that something was going on that was affecting the immune system of folks. All righty. So we've got thymus-dependent cells, so those are T cells. And then you have just regular, the B cells that are derived from bone marrow. Technically, they're all derived from bone marrow, right? See, from the hemocytoblast. Lymph is the fluid that circulates through the lymphatic system. So remember, you got plasma in the blood vessels, right? And then when that basically makes its way out into the tissues, it's then called interstitial tissue, which will be down here. Now, that interstitial fluid, if it goes back into the blood vessels, immediately or pretty soon thereafter, it's now plasma again. But if it goes into the lymphatic vessels, then it's called lymph. So plasma, lymph, interstitial fluid, they're all pretty close to the same thing. There may be little ionic and protein concentration differences, but it's almost the same stuff. It's just depending on where it's at. So if it's in the blood vessels, it's called plasma. If it's in the lymphatic vessels, it's called lymph. And then if it's just in between your cells and the tissues, they call it interstitial fluid. Now, all three of these are quite different from cerebrospinal fluid. Remember that one? That's a very specific fluid. Lymphatic capillaries, they absorb the interstitial fluid and dissolve solutes, and then hopefully your bacteria and viruses, if you have some in your tissues, they end up in there, in your lymphatic capillaries. Much better to be in there than in your regular capillaries, because if you have bacteria, say, growing in your bloodstream, that could lead you to become septic, which is very, very dangerous situation. Now, if it's in your lymph, then it's going to get filtered through the lymph nodes on the way back to the circulatory system, and so it gets exposed to the immune system and hopefully, killed off there. So the lacteal, sorry about that. So the lacteal, we talked about that briefly a little bit ago, and it helps absorb lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins. So they're in the intestines, and I'll show you a picture of that in a little bit. So here's regular capillaries, here's lymphatic capillaries, kind of a parallel, system. And I doubt I would ask you, but you have a complete basement membrane around your capillaries, normal capillaries. Around the lymphatic capillaries, the basement membrane is a little bit incomplete. So it just kind of makes it easier for bacteria and viruses to go into here than into here. So you'd much rather, if you had an infection, out here, you'd much rather that go into your lymph system here, because you're going to have lymph nodes filtering it on the way back, filtering that fluid. They're very similar to veins in that they have valves. The skeletal muscle pumps work on them, and the thoracoabdominal pump also can work on the vessels, on some of the big ones. And here's one thing that lymphatic vessels can do that veins cannot. So they can contract. So it's almost like peristalsis, you know, where you move food through the digestive system. These can squeeze, and it can squeeze the lymph that's in your lymphatic vessels towards the heart, basically. I wish veins could do that, but they can't. But it's nice that your lymphatic vessels can do it. The big ones, anyway. There's a valve. It's pretty cool looking. That's a really good, slide of one. And you can see that lymphatic vessels are pretty much found close to arteries and veins usually. So this is going to make more sense when you can see it, but the thoracic or the left lymphatic duct, it collects lymph from areas inferior to the diaphragm, right? Okay. Well, let me show you this. It'll be easier to explain. So this is a thoracic duct. Okay. It's also been called the left lymphatic duct. Okay, and it goes all the way up here, and then it empties into the left subclavian vein. What areas is this draining? By the way, I call this little area the left lymphatic, and I call this the thoracic. Okay, it's changed like 3 times in the last 5 years. They keep going back and forth. This once upon a time was all called the thoracic duct. Then another point in time, they called the whole thing the left lymphatic duct. And then for a while, they called this the left lymphatic and that the thoracic, which I actually like best. So I kind of stick with that. So I call this the thoracic, and I call this the left lymphatic. So draining into this left lymphatic is everything that you see in dark green. You know, that all that lymph in this part of the body ends up going into here and into that left subclavian vein, right? So it's draining down from here, it's draining up from here, and over from here. It's all draining into what I call the little left lymphatic duct. Here's a little right lymphatic duct. So that's draining everything you see in light green over here. So if I say, you have lymph in your right foot, which blood vessel does that end up draining into? Well, of course, it's going to go up and it's going to drain into that left subclavian vein. You have lymph on the right side of your face or in your right hand. Where's that going to drain into? And then it's going to go into that right subclavian vein. So this is my left subclavian vein. That's my right subclavian vein. So that's the only 2 places that lymph goes back into your bloodstream, right? So think about it. All this is very low pressure. Lymphatic system is very low pressure. So it's got to drain into something even lower pressure. So it has to go into a pretty big vein near the heart because it's low pressure. And so that's where they drain. So don't forget, I could ask a question. You have lymph in your right foot. Which vein does that empty into? And it would be the left subclavian vein. You have it in your right hand. What vein does that end up draining into? And it drains into the right subclavian vein. Got it? Now this is sterny chyli. It looks like a little chili pepper. What chili is almost spelled like chyli, but don't spell it like chili. But it's just a little expanded area at the base of your thoracic duct. Now, you can see the vena cava has been cut here, so you can see behind it. And then if I run out of things to point at, sometimes I point here because this is the best example I have of the azygous vein, which blood from here is draining into there, from this posterior wall here. So azygous just means without a twin. I know you have a little hemiazygous over here, but I usually don't point at that. But the azygous is big. I can point at that. So I could go, A, what is this green thing? You would go, thoracic duct. B, what is this vein right here? You'd go, subclavian. That's my left subclavian. That's my left brachiocephalic, by the way. And that's my superior vena cava. I could go C. What is that little green thing? You go right, lymphatic duct. Then I run out of things to point at. I could go D. What is that? And you go azygous vein. Don't forget cisterna chyli. I could point at that too. So hopefully that makes these slides make sense when you read about them, because it is confusing the way they call the left lymphatic and the thoracic duct the same thing. Okay, so did that, and that's just showing you how many liters a day are you making of lymph, basically, that's collected by the lymphatic vessels. And it's about 2 liters, which is a lot. You know, those 2-liter bottles of Coke, about that much. So that has to go back into your circulation, right? It has to go back into your blood, because otherwise you would get tissue swelling, which would be known as edema. And I got a picture of edema here. This one is actually very specific. This is probably caused by a parasite blocking up those lymphatic capillaries. I think sometimes they call this elephantitis or something like that. It's really kind of sad, because even if you kill the parasite off, sometimes the swelling will not go down. So it can be a big problem. Other things can cause it too, but generally, a lot of times it's a parasite. And I don't know which parasite, I forgot. This, we talked about, let's see, it's kind of hard to see. These big foldings inside your intestine, you don't need to know it for this test, but they're called plica or plica, however you want to pronounce it. And then on the plica, I say plica, these are villi. Now, these are not microvilli. Microvilli are tiny, tiny, tiny. You need a microscope to see them. You can kind of almost see these with your eyes or a good magnification glass. But if you look inside of a villus, villus is singular, there can be a lacteal. And this is in the intestines, don't forget. So that's going to help you absorb fat and fat-soluble vitamins. Now, don't confuse a villus with, you can barely see them. These are microvilli on the surface of these cells. Now, a villus is a pretty big thing, and it can have a lacteal inside of it. Remember Peyer's patch? It's basically just a lymphoid nodule. So I can't count you wrong if you go lymphoid nodule. But the old name is Peyer's patch. And I think they drew this one a little wrong. They drew it way up here in the lamina propria. I think they're normally more down towards the submucosa down here. But don't stress on that. Just know that they're lymphoid nodules, because think about all the bacteria and everything that could be in your intestines. So you need a lot of immune system components here to help defend against that. And that's just showing you the lacteal absorbing the fats and fat-soluble vitamins there. We did that. The other lymphatic nodules, right? We talked about the tonsils, right? So I think I have a picture of the tonsils here. Okay, so that's your palatine tonsil. You can see that when you look in the mirror and go, ah, right? Lingual tonsils, you might not can see them unless you had a dental mirror, but you got 2 of these. You have 2 of these, and then you got 1 pharyngeal tonsil. So sometimes you have to get tonsils out, and generally there's these palatine tonsils, and because of repeated infections. And so on a little kid, it's not usually that serious of an operation. Sometimes they take this out too. But on an adult, be very careful if you're a nurse or a doctor. You have a patient like this, because they can bleed. They can really bleed when you're an adult. It's a pretty serious operation. Don't just go, oh, it's just tonsils. No. They can bleed really badly. So sometimes they have to go back in there with lasers and electrocautery and try to stop the bleeding. I've even heard of them having to get blood transfusions afterwards. So generally on little kids, it's no big deal, although it can go problematic. But on an adult, it can, you got to watch them. Okay. So where were we? We were talking about the lacteal. Now we're going to talk about the lymph node. And so here's a lymph node. They don't really look like this under a microscope. I wish they did. But so I'd probably use a laminate here. So this is an afferent vessel. It's bringing lymph in. See the little arrow? And then here's an efferent vessel bringing lymph out. Let's get a close-up of this. Where is it at? There. So there's my afferent vessel. There's my efferent vessel. Just follow the arrows. This is just the capsule connective tissue. Pay attention to these. That's a germinal center, germinal center, germinal center, right? So this is just a bunch of lymphocytes here. So say this has some bacterium that comes in here. Hopefully it's going to get killed off, and then little pieces of its protein are going to get presented to the immune system. And don't stress on this. You got what you call professional presenter cells in there that do that. They'll put that out on their cell surface and go, hey, look what I found. And so remember, you got lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of lymphocytes in here. And so hopefully you're going to find a B lymphocyte that has the right antibody that sticks to that antigen. And if you do, then that's the one that gets selected, because they all code for different antibodies. It's like the lotto. So the one that finds it has the right antibody that just happens to stick. Then that one's selected for development. The T helper cell is going to help him start dividing. And you're going to make more and more and more of those cells with the correct antibody. And so then eventually you're going to have a lot of antibody. And antibodies can be stuck to the cell surfaces of the lymphocyte, or they can float free. And you'll learn about that's called a plasma cell that does that. You'll learn about that in physiology. But anyway, that's going to help tag, the bacterium, any other bacterium, and have the immune system, target it, hopefully. The middle part of a lymph node is called the medulla. The outer part is called the cortex. Don't confuse the cortex with the capsule. So these germinal centers, that's mainly what I can point at. Or I could point at an afferent lymph vessel, efferent lymph vessel, or a germinal center. That's generally what I point at. That's what lymph nodes look like for real. Pretty cool. Almost look like a little string of pearls, right? Now, let's look at the spleen. It's kind of like a gigantic lymph node that's fed by blood. So see how it looks red, right? See the blood vessels here? It also breaks down red blood cells. It's kind of like the junkyard, right? Can you live without the spleen? Yeah, and then I think the liver just takes up that function. So I love it when they name stuff like this. Don't call this a germinal center. See, this is spleen. So if that's on your microscope or on your slide, I go, what organ is this? You would go, spleen. What is the pointer on? You go, white pulp, which is kind of acting like a germinal center. What is this? Red pulp. So I love it when they name stuff like that. White pulp, red pulp, right? And so remember, red blood cells only live 120 days, so they got to be broken down. Okay. Where else are we at? Did these guys? That's just showing you lymphatic vessels. I don't know how they did this dissection. Whoever did it must have been a master at dissecting. Maybe they're distantly related to Leonardo da Vinci or something. But these are really delicate things, right? And to expose them all like that without tearing them up is, I don't know how they did it. Okay, don't forget your parts. Don't forget your tonsils. Don't forget your thymus. That's a humongous thymus in an adult, by the way. They're normally not that big when you're little, preteen, their thymus is pretty big, but it kind of atrophies as you get older and older. Don't confuse it with the thyroid, right? So that's the thymus. There's the spleen, red pulp, white pulp. There's the lymph node. Make sure you know germinal center, capsule, maybe medulla, maybe cortex, but I doubt it. Probably just germinal centers, afferent vessel, efferent vessel. And then we're cool. Okay. So what I'll do, let's make sure we covered everything. Hold on. Did that. We did the Peyer's patch and the lacteal. And we talked about that. We talked about 2 liters a day. We talked about the difference, where is lymph, where is interstitial fluid, where is plasma. We did that. Make sure you know the pieces and parts. Make sure you know cisterna chyli. I call this thoracic duct, that left lymphatic duct. I call that right lymphatic duct. Make sure you know what areas of the body drain through the left lymphatic duct into the left subclavian, and make sure you know what areas of the body drain through the right lymphatic duct into the right subclavian vein. Pretty easy. Did that. Make sure you know that lymphatic vessels have valves. The thoracoabdominal pump works on the big one going up through the thorax, and the skeletal muscle pumps work on them. And then the great big vessels, lymphatic vessels, can contract on their own. Did that. Okay, I think we're good. All right, so I'm going to put stop share. I'm going to go in meeting, and then I'll put this up for you guys to review. Okay.